Today, we are stepping into the literary courtroom for a pretty huge battle. The defendant? A novel by none other than Charles Dickens. And the charge? Well, the charge is being a complete and utter failure. This is the strange, controversial case of Hard Times.
You know, for over 150 years, this one book has basically split the literary world right down the middle. Was it a total dud, a real blemish on Dickens's incredible record, or was it his single greatest masterpiece? The arguments get pretty fierce, and let me tell you, the answer is not as simple as you might think.
For decades, the whole debate around Hard Times has played out just like a courtroom drama. So that's how we're going to treat it. First, we're going to hear the case for the prosecution, and then we'll get to the stunning case for the defense.
Okay, let's start with the prosecution. Right out of the gate, the initial verdict on Hard Times was, well, it was brutal. Critics basically argued it was the least worth reading of all his major works. So, what on earth was so wrong with it?
The case against the novel, it's really built on this idea that it is fundamentally flawed. That as a story, it just doesn't work. So let's dig into the specific charges, shall we?
The critics, they point to some very specific problems. They say the book is just full of these wild, theatrical overstatements. That the characters are flat, they're just caricatures, not real, living people. They accuse it of being way too dramatic, kind of emotionally confused, and maybe worst of all, that it's missing that unique, brilliant weirdness, that grotesque poetic genius he had for creating these vivid, almost bizarre worlds and people that make his other books, like Bleak House, so unforgettable.
So where did Dickens go so wrong? Well, the prosecution argues it all comes down to one big thing. He was writing about a world he didn't truly understand. Sure, he'd visited some industrial towns, but only for a little bit. He sympathized with the workers, for sure, but he didn't really know their lives. He was an outsider looking in.
And this leads to the prosecution's closing argument. As one critic famously put it, the novel's main setting, Coketown, it feels less like a real place and more like propaganda. For these early critics, the case was closed, guilty as charged.
But then, in the 20th century, the case was dramatically reopened. A powerful new defense emerged, and it was led by the hugely influential critic F.R. Leavis, who basically stood up and argued that everyone had been judging the book completely wrong.
And listen to the audacity of this new defense. It's staggering. Leavis didn't just say Hard Times was, pretty good. He claimed it was Dickens's most completely serious work of art, a novel that shows not just his usual genius, but a unique kind of strength you can't find anywhere else in his work. I mean, wow, this was a bombshell.
Now, Leavis himself asks the obvious question. Okay, if this book is such a masterpiece, why had nobody noticed, right? Why was it almost completely ignored by critics for so long? His answer would change how we think about this novel, and maybe all novels, forever.
The key to Leavis's entire defense is this really radical idea. He argued that critics called it a bad novel because they were expecting it to be a novel. But what if, he asked, what if it wasn't trying to be a novel at all? What if it was something else entirely? A moral fable?
See, back then, everyone pretty much expected a Victorian novel to do certain things. Its job was to create a world, one that was just overflowing with life. The characters were supposed to feel so real you could imagine them walking right off the page. The more details, the more abundance, even if some of it was totally irrelevant to the plot, the better.
But a moral fable, Leavis argued, plays by a completely different set of rules. In a fable, the author's intention, their message, is everything. Every single character, every single event is there for a reason. It's not about creating a realistic world. It's about illustrating a powerful idea. Nothing is wasted. It's all about focus.
So this is the real heart of the argument. You can judge a book by its realism, all its messy, abundant, true-to-life detail. Or you can judge it by its focused moral purpose. One isn't necessarily better than the other, but according to Leavis, they are two fundamentally different ways of making art.
And right here is where the defense rests its case. Because all of a sudden, all those flaws the prosecution pointed out, the flat characters, the over-the-top statements, they aren't flaws at all. They're actually essential features of a moral fable. The characters are caricatures on purpose to represent big ideas. The story is melodramatic to make its moral point with force. The critics weren't seeing a bad novel. They were just refusing to see a brilliant fable.
So, where does all this leave us?
This whole debate, it's about so much more than just one book by Charles Dickens. It's really about the very act of reading and how we judge art.
What the strange case of Hard Times really teaches us is that there's no single correct way to read something. The framework you bring to a work of art, the expectations you have in your head, will completely change what you see. The book itself doesn't change, but our interpretation of it can flip from total failure to absolute masterpiece.
And this brings us to a huge, timeless question. Should art be a perfect mirror, reflecting our messy, complicated world, or should it be more like a laser beam, a focused, powerful tool designed to make us think, to deliver a clear and urgent message? Hard Times really forces us to confront that choice.
So, in the end, the verdict is yours. When you pick up a book, what are you looking for? Realism and that abundant, messy life? Or a focused intention and a powerful moral significance? There's no right answer, of course, but just knowing which question you're asking, well, that's the first step to becoming a better reader.